The following program has been made possible by financial support from the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation.
Welcome to Science in the Written Word. I'm Lou Massa. I'm speaking today to Dr. Dudley Herschbach, a member of the chemistry department at Harvard University. He is Baird Professor of Science. In 1986, he was awarded a Nobel Prize in Chemistry. The occasion for our discussion today is an article by Professor Herschbach published in Harvard Magazine. It's entitled Ben Franklin's Scientific Amusements. Welcome, Dudley. Nice to have you here.
Glad to be with you.
Yeah. Well, of course, the Ben Franklin we're talking about is one of the founding fathers of our country, and he's very well known for that. But I suspect he's probably not as well known as a great scientist.
That's right. I think the image of Ben Franklin is, as far as science goes, is a chubby little guy flying a kite. And that's about it. He's also known as the inventor of bifocals, the inventor of a stove, the Franklin stove, right, and gimmicks. But in fact, in his own day, he was revered as an intellectual. His name was linked to that of Newton. Franklin was called the Newton of electricity. And indeed, in his time, electricity was much more mysterious when he started out than gravity was in Newton's time. Everybody saw apples fall and all. But electricity was this funny business. You rubbed things together and got sparks. Nobody had any idea what it was. And Franklin became intrigued with it when he observed a sort of traveling, there was a lot of traveling people who went around and gave little shows. This is long before TV. Franklin ordered from a friend in England some apparatus and began doing experiments. And he became completely obsessed with it. In fact, he retired at age 42 in order to devote himself completely to his electrical experiments. And yet, we think of him as a model of a practical person, both in political, business, and other affairs. And he would apologize to his friends that he couldn't help himself. He was so intrigued with this, but he couldn't see any use in electricity except perhaps to keep a vain man humble.
Yes.
That's what he said.
How did you come to learn of this whimsical side of Franklin?
Well, when
I mean, he obviously has a serious side, but he loves science from a playful point of view. And how did you come in contact with that?
Well, I first began thinking of Franklin in terms like this way back when I was a graduate student. I think it was 1956, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston had a program celebrating the 250th anniversary of Franklin's birth and the 200th of Mozart. And as many people know, Franklin had invented a musical instrument, the glass harmonica, and Mozart, as well as a number of other well-known composers, had composed for it. So the Academy had constructed a replica, and they read what Franklin and others had written about it. And there was an attempt to play it, and the bowl shattered and all of this. And at this same occasion, there was a performance of a string quartet attributed to Franklin. He had composed it with scordatura tuning, as each string tuned differently, so that the players could play strictly open strings, but each player played 4 different notes, so 16-note music all told. Now, it's not certain among musical experts that Franklin really composed it, but it is in the key of F, and there are a lot of little jokes. At any rate, it gave me this notion that Franklin was an awfully interesting guy to look into. And the more I looked into it, the more I found that he, in fact, did fabulous things. At an early age, he began to do scientific experiments, and his curiosity knew no bounds.
He was totally self-taught, more or less.
He had only 2 years of schooling. He was apprenticed to his father first, just the habit was then. His father was a candlestick maker, and he didn't much care for that, so he was apprenticed to his brother James, who published a newspaper. And he didn't get along at all with his brother James. Actually, one fascinating thing Franklin did, at age 16, he began surreptitiously slipping in a column to the newspaper. His brother didn't know who wrote it. And he took the identity of a young woman. He called her Silence Dogood. He wrote 14 of these Silence Dogood papers. They're very amusing, many of them, and a very perceptive critique of the society of his times. But as you know, already by age 19, he'd run away from his brother and wound up on a boat to England. There he did a lot of remarkable things. I wonder how many people realize that Franklin, unlike the tubby guy that you see in these pictures of the kite flying experiment, he wasn't tubby at all, not when he flew the kite. Or in his younger years, he was an athlete. He is the only founding father in an athletic hall of fame. He had made himself a fine swimmer. And when he was in London, he made ends meet. And as you know, he's very good at making ends meet, giving swimming lessons. He published a little booklet on all these strokes. He describes how on windy days he'd lie on his back with a little sail on the Thames.
And let himself
he could swim for
along.
miles. He made his own little little paddles and so on for his feet, early version of fins. The guy is endlessly fascinating. How many people know that, for example, in 1755, he wrote an essay analyzing population growth, pointing out that there were 1 million people of English descent in the colonies at that time, but only 80,000 had emigrated. And he predicted correctly that the population would grow. It would double about every 25 years. And his prediction remained accurate up to 1860, when there was a great wave of immigrations. Until then, it was just about what Franklin predicted. Malthus, in his essay, cites Franklin, who had really made the key argument already.
I didn't realize that, actually. Quite interesting.
Few people do. So Franklin had that contribution in social science as well as physical science.
Well, speaking of physical science, what about his electrical discoveries? From the point of view of a general perspective, I guess you'd agree that at Franklin's time we probably knew little more than the Greeks knew about electricity.
Exactly right.
I think at the time of Franklin, people knew how to rub materials and build up a charge somewhat bigger than the Greeks were used to, but it would be stored in these Leyden jars.
Exactly. They were very important.
That was about it. There was some discussion of metals being conductors and other things not, but that was about the level of knowledge.
The Leyden jars were important because they led to a lot of experimentation, the kind of thing that Franklin did. And the Europeans were intrigued, and many of their scholars put great effort and wrote all sorts of theories. But Franklin did this series of very beautifully designed, common sense kind of experiments, and then he described them in letters to an Englishman, the same fellow he'd gotten the electrical tubes, as they call them, the equipment that got him started. And this fellow read them to the Royal Society and collected them and actually published them as a book. This book, Franklin was a fine writer. This is a program about writing. I would recommend anybody to read what Franklin writes on almost any subject. It's a pleasure. You know the story of how he taught himself to write. This book was in print for more than 20 years. It was translated into French, German, and Italian, went through 4 editions in English. It was read not only by people who were interested as scientists, but by the general literate public, including the clergy and the aristocracy.
Yes.
The French king, for example, was intrigued, had all of Franklin's experiments repeated in his court. He would also embellish them. He would have grenadiers line up, hold hands, 100 of them, and then connect them to terminals, see them all jump in unison.
That's right.
And, so when Franklin proposed the lightning rod, that really attracted attention, because lightning in his day was considered a supernatural thing. There was disagreement whether it was a weapon of the Lord's or Satan, but it was clearly supernatural. And for example, it was customary to store munitions in churches because it was thought they might have divine protection there.
From lightning.
Yes, even though we know the tower made it much more dangerous. In 1767, a church in Venice had a very large store, I think 100 tons of explosive, struck by lightning, blew up, killed 3,000 people, and destroyed half the city. So
that's interesting, because it's 15 or 20 years after he had introduced the lightning rod. Yeah.
It took about 40 years before the lightning rod was widely adopted, because there were a lot of objection to it. The clergy felt that this was the province of the Lord, and Franklin pointed out that we don't deign to protect ourselves from the thunder and hail and rain of heaven with roofs.
So why not lightning?
Why not protect ourselves from lightning? So it was a fascinating thing. And of course, even today, we have serious damage from lightning. I happened to visit a university last year in which they were just completing repairs. It cost $8 million on their library. They'd been repairing the roof, and they disconnected the lightning rods. The storm came, the building was struck, and the damage was enormous. Yeah. It was closed down for years, and at a cost of $8 million, they're restoring. So, yeah. I mean, it would be wise for people to be more aware of what Franklin offered. But it was almost, it had, in his day, almost the impact of the Copernican business. Because here, this electricity was so mysterious, and he convinced people, and we know he did, in fact, get the right idea what it was, how to think of it having excess or deficit of a charge. So he had the idea of the single fluid theory.
That was really his great contribution.
That was the central thing.
Yeah.
And many other things. He established that you had conductors that would conduct it. You had insulators that wouldn't.
Right.
The importance of grounding. Of course, that was key in the lightning rod, bringing the charge down in the ground. All these basic things, and much of the vocabulary was established by Franklin. Yes. So if he had remained a British subject...
He also discovered the fact that, I guess in modern language we would say the intensity of the electric field lines at a point was very much increased, and of course the points could then be used to draw off charge or lightning, as the case may be.
That's what really led him to the discovery of the lightning rod. I was going to say, if he had remained a British subject, he would surely have been buried in Westminster Abbey right next to Newton, because as I mentioned before, his contemporaries over and over again referred to him as the Newton of electricity. He was elected to the Royal Society as a foreign member and given their highest award, the Copley Medal. I mean, this is astonishing. Here's a guy way out in the wilderness. No connection, any center of learning at all. And he solves this problem.
And he's sending in these letters that are read at the Royal Society.
Right. Exactly.
He was also a member of the French Academy,
which is a very great distinction. There are never more than 8 foreigners at any given time, and he was the first American so honored, the only one for another century. So his stature as an intellectual and as a scientist was immense in his day. It was something comparable to say, Einstein in our century.
Yes.
And of course, Newton and his.
The comparison to Newton is really not far-fetched, is it? I mean, people are fond of saying that Newton connected the falling of an apple with what you might call the falling of the Earth around the sun in its orbit. And in a similar way, by analogy, Franklin sort of connected the tiny sparks that we build up on Earth to this
lightning bolts.
Exactly.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I was very fond of that.
There's this famous phrase which you mentioned in your article from Turgot, this colleague of Lavoisier, actually, that
said,
Franklin snatched the lightning from the skies.
And the scepter from tyrants.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. Oh, he was enormously popular when he became minister to France, both because of course, his role as a patriot, but he was already known for many, many years because of his scientific stature. So if there were T-shirts in those days, his likeness would have been all over them, but in fact there were not. Instead, they're medallions of all kinds. He wrote his daughter saying that his face in France was as familiar as the man in the moon. And it was literally so. So much so that Louis XVI became rather annoyed and gave his favorite mistress a chamber pot with a medallion of Franklin pasted on the bottom. And the way Franklin reacted to that was characteristic. He had a bunch of such chamber pots manufactured with a likeness of George III on the bottom.
So, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Now let's see, does the Kite Experiment kind of brings together this tremendous theoretical advance of Franklin? Could you describe the nature of the Kite Experiment?
Well, originally he proposed that the experiment should be done in a tall building. And then he realized that, gee, he could do it with a kite, because Philadelphia didn't have any building
that tall
for his purpose. And all these pictures you see of him with his little son and the pot belly and all that, as I mentioned earlier, he was a real athlete, a beautiful specimen at the time he did the Kite Experiment. He was only about 40. He knew exactly what he was doing. There were all these remarks about he might have killed himself and so forth. No, he knew what he was doing. He knew how you had to ground yourself properly.
Right.
And all the rest.
He actually described that very carefully in his original suggestion for the experiment.
That's right.
Yeah.
And when you read what he wrote, you see he understood completely what was going on. And,
on the other hand, is it not so that he did manage to hurt himself once trying to cook up a turkey or something?
Yes, yes, he describes this. I mean, they had parties in which they cooked everything electrically. And there was an occasion in which he knocked himself flat. It was a big charge. He also entertained the neighbors. He had an iron fence around his front yard, and he would wire it up so sparks would leap all around and people would come.
Yeah.
And in his home, he had a special version of a lightning rod. It was in two parts. It came down from the roof, and another part came up from below, and there was a gap of several inches. And it had a silk thread between connecting the two with a little brass ball riding on it. So if a thundercloud went over and polarized the one rod a little bit, developed a little charge there, the ball would move and pick it up and then rattle back and forth for a while. If there were lightning, then you didn't get sparks jumping. And when he was off in England, his wife wrote saying this was driving her nuts. And he wrote back and said, well, just put a copper wire connecting them. There'll be no more problem. But he would enjoy telling how he could sometimes read a newspaper by the light of the sparks.
Yes, yes. I wonder if we could discuss, well, of course, we agree that he had this tremendous interest in a whole wide variety of things, all kinds of ingenious experiments.
He mapped the Gulf Stream, for example.
Yeah.
He crossed the Atlantic 8 times, and his world was far larger than ours. It took, depending on the direction you went, 4 to 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Yeah. And he had heard rumors about a stream. And so he actually mapped it, and during the Revolutionary War, he was careful that that information would not get to the British because it was a real military advantage to know that you could get into the
Exactly.
Gulf Stream. It enabled your ships to move a lot faster. He also did a wonderful experiment that he thought of first in connection with one of these trips. He noticed when the cooks threw greasy water overboard, there'd be a big slick
this
with
is
no
fascinating.
waves.
Yeah, this is really fascinating, actually.
So this led him to a wonderful experiment in which he deliberately cast oil in the water. There's a book
Tell
by
us about
Charles
that,
Tenford.
because it seems like a very significant experiment that has had a long legacy, really.
Exactly. Charles Tenford devoted a whole book called Ben Franklin Still the Waves to tracing the descendants, the progeny of this Ben Franklin experiment. And Franklin describes beautifully in a letter to a friend, as most of his scientific experiments were described in letters. Didn't have journals in those days.
Right.
He describes how this pond in Chaplin, England, where he was at the time, was ruffled by the waves, and he tossed about a teaspoon and was astonished to see the waves still over half an acre. Well, you know the volume of oil, you know this area.
Right.
So from the ratio of volume to area, you can calculate the thickness
Of
of
the
this.
single molecule.
Well,
On average.
He didn't calculate it. Later, it was calculated
Right.
exactly that way by Lord Rayleigh,
Yes.
who repeated more than 100 years later Franklin's experiment for that very purpose. It was the first quantitative estimate of the size of a molecule. And it's interesting why it was that Franklin did not deduce the size of a molecule.
What was he missing there?
Well, he spoke, as Newton already had, and many others, of corpuscles of matter, but their conception was that the corpuscles were all identical. They didn't have the idea we have a molecule. A molecule, as we know, can be very different in its different parts. A corpuscle, which is as far as they got,
Hard
was
little
something
ball,
to be-
more or less.
A hard little ball, but in any case, everyone identical, no
Right.
different differentiation among parts. And so he knew that like repelled like electrically, and so he would imagine that these corpuscles were repelling and spreading out. And if that's the case, there's no necessary connection between the thickness of the film and the size of an individual corpuscle, because they may be repelling one another and spreading
Right.
all out. The modern conception, and what Lord Rayleigh was able to appeal to, is that the oil molecule, he was using olive oil, has a oil-like end and a water-loving end. It has hydroxyl groups on it. The water-loving end goes in the water. The oil ends are sticking up, and they like each other, so they get cheek by jowl and make a monomolecular film.
Right.
So provided it's monomolecular, then you can take the ratio of volume to
Area.
and get the height. And of course, from the density, you can calculate the mass too.
Exactly.
So Franklin actually could have done that if he had this one notion that
Of
the
the monolayer.
molecule could have had different ends, one
Yes.
getting close together and the other in the water. So he lacked it, but his experiment nonetheless was the impetus to
Lord
Rayleigh's
Rayleigh, yeah.
work. And there's a lovely story connected with that I'm sure Franklin would have enjoyed. I mentioned how at age 16 he wrote the Silence Dogood letters, taking the identity of a young woman, showing great sympathy for this young woman's situation. He depicted her almost like a Candide-type character.
Mm-hmm.
She had had all kinds of terrible things happen to her, and she was still cheerful and all. But
The best of all worlds.
the Lord Rayleigh, after he published his repeat of Franklin's experiment, received a letter in German from a German housewife. Agnes Baucus was her name. And to his credit, his German wasn't very good, but with the help of his wife, he deciphered it and discovered that Agnes Baucus had done in her kitchen some very nice experiments on films and water. And she had solved one of the major experimental problems, namely, if you put one of these films and it hits the surface and all, it gets things dirty.
That's something that's what bothered Franklin about the idea of a scale model of his original.
Franklin pointed out that it would be difficult to do this in a laboratory experiment because the oil would spread until it hit the vessel, and it therefore wouldn't be able to get as thin as it would on a pond.
But Agnes had the perfect experimental technique to overwhelm that problem.
Other people could do it in their kitchen now. You get a rectangular baking dish, say a nice Pyrex dish, and you get a ruler that you can scrape across the surface and clean it.
Have a perfectly clean surface, yeah.
She also did other charming things. She measured the surface tension, very important property of any liquid, by suspending a button on a thread and determining the force it took to pull the button.
What could be
simpler?
simpler?
The surface. As we know, surface tension makes sort of, in effect, a skin on the water that resists motion. So Lord Rayleigh, that was always translated Agnes Baucus' letter, corresponded with her to clear up some points, submitted it to the journal. It was the first of a number of articles. I think she published 40 or 50 articles.
Wow. Yeah.
And they established really a number of important aspects of surface chemistry. Years later, she was lauded by Irving Langmuir, a Nobel laureate in surface chemistry, an American, as having established the basis for all of this work.
Dudley, we have about 1 minute left. Let me ask you an important thing. You've emphasized in this article the amusement that Franklin got out of this work. He started out being interested in things. He wasn't necessarily, for example, trying to invent lightning rods. He wasn't necessarily trying to do anything practical. It turns out that these things are very practical. But the thing I want to ask you about is, do you think there's something that in modern times that we can learn from Franklin and his amusements and his attitude toward science?
Yeah, I think what needs to be understood, and Franklin clearly did understand it, is that when it comes to trying to understand nature, we have to realize nature speaks an alien language, many alien tongues. And the basic scientist is trying to unravel one of those dialects, some of the grammar, some of the vocabulary. To the extent you succeed, you discover nature's left all these wonderful messages. And if you can read them, oh my gosh, all sorts of things open up. And this is why curiosity-driven research, so to speak, it might better be called ignorance-driven research, is so practical in the end.
Yes.
And Franklin illustrates it very well.
We have to quit. Thanks very much, Dudley.
Sure.
The preceding program has been made possible by financial support from the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation.